Good afternoon. Thanks, everyone, for being here. I'm Tad Stanky, Director of Policy and Programs at Human Rights First, and we're exceptionally pleased to have a terrific lunchtime panel today to talk about reform of U.S. detention policies in the context of immigration reform, which is on everyone's mind here in Washington. So without further ado, I will just introduce our moderator, Ted Alden. Ted is the Bernard L. Schwartz Senior Fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations here in Washington, and the author of The Closing of the American Border, Terrorism, Immigration, and Security Since 9/11. And Ted was also the project director for the CFR's Independent Task Force on U.S. Immigration Policy in 2009. So, Ted, please take it away. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Tad. Welcome, everybody, to this lunch panel on the issue of transforming U.S. detention policies in the context of immigration reform. I want to say a big thanks to Alyssa Massimino and to Ruthie Epstein for organizing this wonderful series of events. We ended this morning's session on what I thought was the right note, which is that the problems in the U.S. immigration detention system have been decades in the making and will not be solved just by a few tweaks to the process to try to make it a bit more humane. We could start in a lot of places to understand how we got to where we are today. We could go back to the big 1965 immigration reform legislation, the bill that our immigration system still functions under today, which did a lot of positive things in terms of starting the modern era of mass immigration to the United States, but actually had very few provisions to allow lower skilled folks from Mexico or from Central America to come to the United States and work, and so created a powerful set of incentives for people to come here illegally. We could look at the 1986 Immigration Reform and Control Act, the legislation that was supposed to once and for all solve the problem of illegal immigration. We were going to give legal status to 3 million people. We were going to create a tough enforcement system, and the problem would go away. As many of you know, it didn't work out quite that way. The enforcement pieces never played out the way they were supposed to. Again, there were no provisions for legal channels for people to come, particularly from Mexico and Central America. And so that population of 3 million unauthorized immigrants rose to 12 million. We could look at the 1996 immigration bill, which made it mandatory that many people facing removal deportation be detained until they were removed from the country. Provisions that set big penalties if you'd been living out of status in the U.S. for a period of time and tried to go home to set your status straight, you were going to be barred for the country for 10 years. So a whole set of provisions that made the system much harder edged than it had been. And then finally, we can look at the reaction, which I wrote about in my book that Tad generously mentioned. We look at the reaction to the 9/11 terrorist attacks, when there was real concern that perhaps someone who had been arrested on immigration violation or had come to the country seeking asylum, but we'd allow them to go free while we were considering their case, that person might be involved in some kind of future terrorist attack. There had been an incident in the mid-90s with someone, ironically, who'd actually come down from Canada, who had been arrested and released and told to appear later for a hearing to decide whether he would be deported, and then went on to participate in one of the efforts to bomb New York in the mid-1990s. So the Bush administration announced the end of what was known as catch and release. So in the future, if government found people on immigration violations, in most cases they would be held in detention while their cases were being considered by the immigration courts, and eventually perhaps they'd be removed from the country. So this was an issue that we tackled in the 2009 CFR Task Force report, which is a piece of work I'm still really proud of. It was co-chaired by Jeb Bush, the former governor of Florida, Matt McClarty, the White House Chief of Staff under President Clinton. Reverend Land was a crucial member of that task force. Alyssa Massimino played a big role. There were many others. And we said at the time that the detention system as it exists in the country now violates core American values regarding humane treatment and the dignity of the individual. So the goal of this panel is to look at the prospects for trying to solve some of these issues in the context of broader immigration reform legislation. So we all know that Congress is busy at work on this, the Gang of Eight in the Senate, there's a bipartisan group in the House. We could see legislative language possibly as early as this week, probably more likely next week or the week after. There's a lot of work been going on the Hill on all of the various aspects of immigration reform. The issue of detention is not one that has been front and center, and one of the goals, obviously, of this session is to try to make it a higher priority. So I'm delighted to have with me on my immediate left Wade Henderson, the president and CEO of the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights, a leader in civil rights in this country for many, many years, and the immigration issue is nothing if not a civil rights issue. On the far left, Richard Land, president of the Ethics and Religious Liberty Commission of the Southern Baptist Convention. He and I have been sharing a lot of stage time recently. He has been a tireless leader in the evangelical movement pushing for intelligent immigration reform, and I think if a bill passes through Congress, there's nobody's going to deserve more credit than Reverend Land. And then, for the second time, thank you for on the second half of a doubleheader, Julie Myers-Wood, who, as was introduced this morning, the former Assistant Secretary for U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement, the agency that's responsible for carrying out these laws and is now an advisor to a number of countries working on alternatives to detention. So I'd like to start you off with a broad question, which is, how would you like to see the Congress look at this set of issues, detention, removal, in the context of a broader immigration reform bill? Richard, why don't I'll start here with you, and then we'll...
Well, if you're talking about in terms of detention for people who are seeking asylum, I think we need to, we don't need to wait for legislation. I think we need to just encourage the administration to act. There has been improvement. I served on the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom for 11 years. We did a report several years ago on this and called for some changes in the ways the courts dealt with this, made sure that they had more information about the nature of the folks that were coming before them, and that particularly refugees from religious persecution were on the rise around the world. Unfortunately and sadly, persecution in the name of religion is waxing, not waning, in the world, and is producing more refugees who by the very nature of the fact they're persecuted and they're being attacked when they leave, don't have the kind of documentation that makes lawyers and judges happy often. And that we certainly need to reform how they're detained and where they're detained while they're awaiting trial. I think that the prison-like facilities need to be abandoned and turned into facilities that don't remind people of prisons. They need to be in better locations. There's a new USERF report that's going to be coming out in the next couple of weeks that's a follow-up that points out that there have been improvements, but there's still a ways to go. And the one thing I think that would need legislative action, and I think we should all support, is to do away with the one-year rule. Because a lot of these folks, because of the nature of how they come to America and they're fleeing persecution, often are not aware that there's a one-year rule. They're trying to get their lives back together. Many of them have been...
Just to be clear, this is the rule that only gives you a year to file your application for asylum after you arrive in the United States.
Once you arrive in the U.S., you've got 12 months.
Yeah, and if you miss that,
you're done. Yeah. A lot of these people have really suffered terribly, and their lives have been shattered, and they're trying to get their lives back together. They're in a foreign country, they don't speak the language, and that year can pass by, and they've forever lost their chance. I just think that is that's a rule that may have had good intentions, but it's had bad consequences, and it needs to be changed.
Thank you. Mr. Henderson.
Yeah, thank you, Ted. I'm honored to be on this panel. Great to share a microphone with my colleagues. I agree very much, Reverend Land, with your framing of the asylum issue in moral terms. I want to step back for a bit. I see the need for comprehensive immigration reform as one of the defining civil and human rights issues of the 21st century. I think that the issue of immigrant detention is related to, in some ways, the issue of mass incarceration in the United States. we over-incarcerate both on a criminal perspective and on an immigrant perspective. And if you look at the role that race and systemic discrimination play in the mass incarceration issue, you will see elements of that same phenomenon appearing on the immigrant detention side. Immigration detention is a civil issue. The fact that we incarcerate so many in detention circumstances that border on the inhumane is an issue that requires immediate attention. It's not going to be resolved, however, in isolation. It can only be resolved as part of a comprehensive solution to immigration reform. Now, I think it's an important issue and it should have a higher visibility than it does. But the truth is, it's a secondary concern to the larger debate about the need for comprehensive reform. We're talking, for the most part, about a path to citizenship for the 11 million. We're talking about resolving the need for visas for low-wage workers, for high-tech workers, and whether or not there's going to be a rejiggering of visas for family reunification in favor of visas for high-tech workers and others. Completely ignores the due process issues that are inherent in this debate, completely ignores the kind of inhumane treatment highlighted so graphically in the New York Times a couple of weeks ago with the talk about how the immigrant detention system works. And here's my last point. There are factors that drive increased detention that have nothing to do with national security issues, with civil rights enforcement issues, or with immigration as a domestic law enforcement consideration. You have private companies like the Corrections Corporation of America that are driving detention policies by mandating minimal requirements for those to be detained, minimum numbers, that must be detained in a system that is driven by an economic incentive and spread by companies that profit on the incarceration and detention of immigrants. That's not going to change because money is deeply embedded in the system. And only by shedding sunlight on these practices will you see those issues change. My last point is this. There are still racial dimensions to the immigration problem that obviously are not comfortable but must be addressed. So there's an issue of racial profiling. Now, let me just say, prior to 9/11, Attorney General Ashcroft and President Bush were prepared to address, in the domestic context, the racial profiling issue, and said so on the record. And I am confident that that was the case, and without bipartisan support, you can't reform these issues. 9/11 occurred, injected a new dimension into the racial profiling debate involving Muslims, Arab Americans, and others, and we are delayed in trying to address that issue during that time period. The Gang of Eight is likely to produce a bill that will include an element to address the racial profiling issue in the context of immigration reform, and we should support it. And we need to be able to bring light to those issues in ways that can be effective. So last issue, comprehensive reform is the only viable way to really make significant reforms of the detention process. Some of it can be done legislatively. Some of it can be done by executive order. We're not going to be able to amend substantially the Gang of Eight bill. That's part of what is delaying its introduction. They would like to have a bill that is protected on all sides from amendment by getting an agreement among the Gang of Eight that they will oppose any amendment to the core of the bill, which gives us a limited hope about changing detention policies unless we look at a comprehensive solution that involves both legislation and executive action. So that's where I'll begin.
Thank you very much. Very thorough. I appreciate that. Ms. Wood, what would be your wish list if you were to go to Congress and say, here's what the Congress can do to really make the system operate in a more intelligent, effective way?
Sure. I think my top list is actually to get a bill out that will get passed. And so I think there are many things that would be on my wish list that are not on my must-have list. And so I hope that all of us who are fighting for immigration reform will think about that. How can we make sure that we support the efforts that come from the Gang of Eight, we support the legislation so we can actually get a bill, even if it's not perfect, but that will dramatically change the lives for millions who are here in this country and start to have an immigration system that works. That being said, if I were there crafting the bill, one thing I would do to get an immigration detention system that works would actually be to get an immigration system that works. In some places, it takes 5 years to wade through the immigration courts to determine whether or not I'm here in this country illegally. It is not that kind of a determination, right? We need to reform the immigration courts, and that needs to be a top priority. And if we address that, that's going to have collateral beneficial effects on detention. We also should look at mandatory detention. I know it was discussed this morning, but 236C, how's that working out in real life? How is that, can we use alternatives to detention? Can we reduce the classes of people that are considered eligible under 236C? And then what about bonds and our ROR? What can we do there? So, let's get a system that works. Just to take one other example, I think about if I came here from a visa waiver country, on my way in, I would waive away kind of many of my rights, okay? And so if I overstayed my visa, on the way out, it would be a very quick and speedy process. If I came here not from a visa waiver country, I could tie up the immigration courts for years. And so, treating people kind of in a similar way would be part of my wish list. I would also look at what the agency has done, I think, over the last 5 or 6 years, and I would codify some of those things to make sure that we're starting from a higher ground level. In particular, I would look at the risk assessment and, to make sure that ICE is building in a sophisticated risk assessment to its processes. I would also look at the standards that ICE has and continues to improve upon. I would not mandate them in a way that keeps ICE from ever changing the standards or improving the standards, but I'd mandate them in a way that makes sure they have them and they're using them and relying on them to make individualized determinations. And I think that's one of the problems we saw with 236C, frankly, and those would all be parts of my wish list.
Excellent, excellent. Let me ask one more broad overview question, then we'll drill down in on a few things. Well, one of the things that I must say really surprised me when I worked on my book, and I was writing a lot about what happened to a lot of immigrant detainees after 9/11. I was surprised to discover that the due process rights for immigrants are nothing like they are for citizens, that you can be held for very long periods of time while your case kind of grinds through the immigration court. So, eventually it may be that the courts will say, yes, you have a right to stay in the United States, but you'll have lost 18 months of your life waiting for the courts to make that determination. What's a reasonable set of rights for people whose legal status in the United States is uncertain?
Well, let me pick up on Julie's point, because I think that reforming the immigration courts are a big part of the solution to the problem that you've identified. Let's start with the fact that the 96 Immigration Act, which you didn't mention in your list of acts that came through, severely constricted the flexibility of the immigration system and imposed mandatory minimum detention requirements and removed discretion from immigration judges in handling cases that in fact required that kind of individualized review that Julie referred to, but that can't now be achieved. So any kind of reform that looks at the system, that tries to restore an element of flexibility by way of a return of discretion is something that we think would be really beneficial. I think what most Americans become surprised by is the fact that the due process requirements are so radically different from what we would anticipate would be the case, given our own system of justice and given the fact that immigration is considered a civil penalty, not so much the need for criminal penalties. I guess my only point is that, look, Senator Coons of Delaware recently held a hearing on these issues and the part of comprehensive reform. He deserves to be lifted up, because that was a courageous effort to look at due process questions that are absolutely relevant to the decision for comprehensive reform. But I also think that a judicious combination of executive branch action, which the president can do, to complement what can be accomplished legislatively, is really the only way to move some of this forward. We've had meetings with agency heads, and again, I just want to say that Secretary Napolitano has been open and willing to discuss these issues, much to her credit, as has the Attorney General. But obviously, until a bill is introduced, they are constricted about what they can say. What I would look to is to be able to really create that kind of balance. And one last point, guys, we have to have bipartisan support to make this happen. It won't happen without that. So whatever system that we construct has to be able to appeal to Republicans as much as Democrats. That's why this argument about economic impacts of detention on local communities and state budgets are a way to drive this forward. These communities are hard hit right now with the economic crisis of the country. Detention is costly. In addition to being morally improper, it's costly. And I think that economic argument can help drive this debate as well.
Richard, if I could, I mean, how do you speak to Republicans on some of these issues? Because I've certainly dealt a lot on the border security issues. There are real concerns over having a system that has integrity. So how do you try to ensure folks that the system has integrity, but will work in a way that is fair, more due process, more humane?
And I would encourage everyone, if you have not read the CFR Task Force report, read it. It's one of the best documents on the subject, which 102 pages, 110 pages.
That sounds right. I just gave away my last copy today, so I can't double check.
It's really, it's very well balanced. He did a wonderful job. He was such a great facilitator. I know he went through every page of it with me, page by page, and I think you did that with almost everybody that would sit down long enough to do it with you. And it points out that there are, first of all, and this is something that appeals to Republicans. The country that's going to lead the world in the 21st century is the country that can get the greatest mass of brain power to do its research and its work and its entrepreneurship within its borders, no matter where it was born. Now, we start out with an advantage there because we're a nation of immigrants. But there are other countries that are now fervently competing with us for the world's brain power. And comprehensive immigration reform that allows the high-end folks to come in. I mean, frankly, I think anyone who gets a PhD in a hard science from an American university ought to have a green card stapled to their diploma. And we ought to encourage them to stay here and do their research here. A second thing is that this system is broken. A lot of Republicans, a lot of Democrats are offended that their government doesn't enforce the law. They're offended when the law's not enforced. And, I had one Republican congressman say to me, well, it's just wrong to disobey the law. And I said, well, yeah, it's true, but it's also wrong. It's also morally wrong not to enforce the law. And the example I use is that, for the last 20 years, our immigration system, we've had two signs up at the border. One says no trespassing, and the other one says help wanted. We've allowed 11 to 14 million people to come here, to work here, to invest their lives here. And now we're going to say retroactively, by the way, we're now going to retroactively enforce a law that we haven't enforced for the last 20 years. That would be like the U.S. government sending me a registered letter saying, we've been monitoring your driving habits on the interstate for the last 20 years. We've never issued you a ticket, but we have noticed every time of the hundreds of times that you have exceeded the speed limit. And now we're going to give you a ticket retroactively for every time you broke the speed limit. And until you pay this enormous fine, we're going to confiscate your car. I don't think most Americans would feel that's fair. They wouldn't want to be treated that way, and that's exactly what we're talking about with the current immigration system and those who are calling for enforcement and those who are calling for deportation. And then I would say also, realistically, there is no way anyone who thinks that we're going to deport 11 to 14 million people against their will is delusional. That's delusional. I don't know how many of you remember where you were when you saw Elian Gonzalez taken out of his home and sent back to Cuba. I remember where I was. I got up and vomited. I was so upset at what had happened. If we tried to deport those who are here in undocumented status, there are 1 million Elian Gonzalez's, and it wouldn't take very many before the process would stop. So the reality is, do we want to have a system like they have in Europe where you have a permanent sort of underclass? Or do you want to have a pathway to earned permanent status and citizenship for those who want it and who want to remain in the United States? And I think that the key to getting a lot of Republican support is guaranteeing that we don't have a repeat of what happened in '86, where you had supposedly we were going to solve the problem by granting legal status to those that were here, and then we were going to secure the border. Well, we didn't secure the border. Frankly, I don't think you can secure the border until you turn off the magnet, which is the workplace. You've got to secure the workplace before you can secure the border. It's doable. It's certainly doable. We could ask everyone who comes forward and registers to give us a thumbprint. Everybody gets a thumbprint by about 16 weeks gestation in the womb, and it never changes for the rest of your life. The size of it changes, but the actual unique thumbprint never changes. And then you say to employers, you hire somebody who doesn't have the correct documentation, and we're going to fine you significantly, and if you do it again, we're going to put you in jail. That'll turn off the magnet. It will take care of the unscrupulous employers, and it'll then make it so that we can control the border, because those who are trying to come across for economic reasons will not come any longer because they won't be able to get work. Then we give a pathway to earned status and earned legalization and earned citizenship for those who want it. Anyone who thinks that what's being advocated or will be advocated by the Gang of Eight is amnesty needs a course in remedial English themselves. Amnesty is what Jimmy Carter gave to those men who went to Canada to avoid service in Vietnam. They got to come home, no penalty, no fine, no probation. Now let me be clear, I would have let them come home, but I would have required they spend 2 years working at minimum wage in veterans hospitals, taking care of the guys who took their place.
I want to ask you, if you've spent a lot of time running the gauntlet of congressional hearings. If you had to go up there and say, not an easy experience,
me, huh?
not an easy experience. You have to go up there and you say, alternatives to detention are better. We need to create humane facilities for these people, even though they've broken the law. Maybe we should expand access to counsel. How do you sell something like that to the Congress? What kind of arguments do you make?
I think one of the things you have to make, and I don't know if it's been successful, I think we'll start to see, is what the current state of reality is now. And I think that there are a lot of people who are saying, it's not fair, there's not enforcement. You know what? It's not going to be fair if there is a regularization. But we've got to get over that because our system is broken. We don't have enough resources to do enforcement. And we've kind of got to move past whether or not it's fair and move back to what's right for our country long term. And what's right for our country long term is to have an immigration system that works. I think one of the things, and there were so many excellent points in both those statements here, but one of the things that's really key is getting a handle on the magnet, getting a handle on kind of worksite enforcement. And, if people didn't have to come here illegally to get a job, if they could come here the right way. Right. They can't right now. And so we have, an imbalance in our labor demand, and that's causing problems. And because there was not enforcement over 20 and 30 years, people have built up, in many cases, a lot of very sympathetic situations. And so it's not a good thing to have to be in the enforcement role. When you're ICE, and I was the head of ICE, which is an agency responsible for the entire United States, 46 countries, all along the border, we had less people than and do that kind of deportation. It's simply not reasonable. So where do we get to kind of a better place? And one thing to build upon Richard's point is to really put employer verification back on the government instead of the clerk. I worry about the HR clerk that's going to have to interpret that thumbprint. Yeah. That is not a good situation to be in, and that creates kind of a lot of fraud. So how can you put it back on the government? It's their responsibility to make a full determination, and I think you can do it.
Contracted out to American Express. Literally. Yeah. Some of you had the same experience. If I use my credit card 3 times a half an hour in Oxford, I get a phone call on my cell phone. This is American Express. We just want to make sure that you're in Oxford and you're using using your American Express card. And I'm going, well, yes, I am. I'm sort of glad, but I'm a little disturbed that you know where I am. But literally, our financial system has a way, technically, to do verification at the job site.
absolutely, but it's going to cost money.
Yes.
And so I guess that, that I think for a lot of Republicans to sell the deal, we have to show that it's really going to work this time. And so how are we going to provide the appropriate kind of resources and technology, not just adding people, it's not just boots on the ground, but technology to make sure that we have a system that works and that we have the amount of labor that we need. And I'll put in a plug for the low-wage workers, frankly. I work with a lot of meat packers and other companies. I mean, there's a desire for more legal low-wage workers. And so, a lot of the talks have been about the high tech, but actually, the low-wage industries, they need a workforce as well.
Well, let me say two things. First, I think the border is, relatively speaking, secure. It's certainly more secure today than it's ever been. And Secretary Napolitano herself, in testifying before Congress, has reinforced the fact that this argument that the border is insecure is false and should not be used as a basis for imposing additional barriers on a path to citizenship or conditions precedent that can't be met, given the fact that we've invested a considerable amount. And I think the trip that Senators McCain and Schumer took to the border helped reinforce that. Secondly, the E-Verify program, which, look, obviously is fraught with problems and from a civil libertarian standpoint raises real questions. But E-Verify is on the table in a way that nothing of comparable dimension previously existed in ways that help employers verify prospective employees. Now, let me say, guys, a biometric thumbprint is a bridge too far. We're not going there. And I would hope that there would not be a serious effort to impose additional requirements, both out of cost but out of civil libertarian concern. Now, the low-wage worker. Let me say that, revising the visas that you've talked about, and Richard, I agree that there is an additional need for the high-tech visa. You just saw that when the visas were made available, they were exhausted in about 3 or 4 days.
3 days, yeah.
3 days.
72 hours.
So obviously the number of visas that need to be made available to companies like Microsoft, Google, a host of others, has to be more significant than it is. That's number one. There are concerns that have been raised about it. We can address those concerns, but let me put those aside for a minute. The low-wage worker, the low-wage visa, the meat packers, the others, it's a problem, guys. I understand that they argue there is a need for more visas. Under the proposal that's on the table now, they'd start with 20,000. Over 5 years, they could go up to 200,000, but that had to be determined by a labor force dimension assessed by the Department of Labor and the government. Here's the problem. We have a level of unemployment in the African-American community that is unconscionable. We have accepted nearly double the rate of standard employment as if that's the way the world works. 15% unemployment is simply unconscionable. Some of those individuals who are not captured in those numbers are individuals who have been failed by our education system, have no high school diploma, and are virtually the walking dead when it comes to economic participation. We can't afford to have a flood of of low-wage workers if they are competing for the few select jobs for which this community might otherwise qualify. Now, I'm not saying that's the case. I'm saying that that's subject to empirical review. I want to see the statistical data that justifies the expansion of low-wage workers based on an empirical analysis of workforce needs. And I don't want to see employers artificially suppressing wages, which then creates a de facto need for expansion, and you bring in low-wage workers to further exploit them. I can't have that either. So I think we have to look for options.
Yeah, well, one of the things the task force report points out is that because of employer exploitation of undocumented workers, and they're paying them below minimum wage because they can't complain, that if we had a legal system that worked, it would probably raise wages at the bottom level by about 12%. Just automatically. Now, that's a pretty good rise for people who are working at the bottom. 12%. And that would just be just getting rid of the unfair competition of the current undocumented with those who are
this is a huge issue, but I'd like not to get too diverted on it just because we're trying to focus on this panel. But it's a core issue. And this is what the unions and the business community have been talking about. There's a lot of stuff to do. I want to ask you actually each to put on your crystal ball. So take Richard's scenario that we do get a comprehensive immigration bill passed, does have a path to citizenship. Some significant number of the 11 million come forward and they have legal status. How does this change the situation in terms of enforcement and detention going forward? Julie, I'd like to start with you. I mean, what happens to ICE if a piece of legislation like that goes through? How does its operations change? How does its mandate change?
Well, a lot of it will actually still be the same, because there will be in any regularization program, you'll have 8 to 10% that would not be eligible, and ICE could spend all of its time working to make sure that those individuals who are not eligible are brought into the immigration court system and then removed if they're ordered removed. I think ICE will also initially have a challenge kind of looking through the immigration detention system and also the non-detained docket to see who on there might be eligible. And how can we make sure that those folks have the information they need? Ideally, in a bill, you'd have access to counsel, so ICE is not having to provide that information. But assuming you don't, ICE is going to be having to look at that and engage that. I think one new challenge for ICE will be those individuals who come forward and raise their hand. And we know that not everybody who's eligible will come forward and raise their hand, right? But a lot will. Some who come forward and raise their hand will not be eligible. And so what happens to those individuals? So ICE will have some responsibility to monitor those individuals, to deal with those individuals. Do you want to, when they're determined not eligible, to put them in detention? Maybe not. Maybe you want to do something else. But how does ICE make sure that they don't kind of go back into the shadows? And then frankly, what about the people that cross the border or overstay their visa on day X+1? And are not eligible? And how can ICE show and CBP show that they're really serious about enforcement? And we hope that the numbers in this bill are going to give the labor demand that's needed. But how do we make sure that people stop overstaying their visas? Because I mean, it's not a good situation when you don't know who's overstayed their visa, who's the border's more secure. But as we know, the senators saw somebody climb over, while they were there. So we want to make sure that post a bill, we're doing a good job in keeping things safe.
Is it going to be a different system, though, you think? I mean, are we still going to have 34,000 detention beds? Is the process still going to operate largely as it does? Or will the reduced pool really change in some ways how that operates?
Well, it will depend, obviously, on how the bill is structured, who is eligible and who's not. Right now, most of the individuals in ICE detention are either recent border crossers, which you still will have some, right? Maybe not as many. We all know that right now there are a lot of people kind of coming in now, so maybe you won't have as many immediately after that. And then people that are being released from jails and prisons. And will those individuals be eligible? Some of them will be, right? But some of them won't be. So you'll still have that. I think you might have to look at, my own personal view is what sort of security is needed. So maybe it'll be kind of the worst of the worst who are not eligible. Those folks may not be great candidates for a place like Carnes, like a civil detention facility. They may actually need a more secure facility, right, in order to ensure public safety while they're going through the process. I think ICE will have to look at all those things.
Crystal ball, wait.
Yeah, well, first of all, for the lawyers in the room, let me remind you, this is the 50th anniversary of Gideon versus Wainwright. And we are finding the failure to address both the letter and spirit of Gideon has a profound impact on the access to justice. And I think lawyers have an obligation to address it. In the context of the immigration legalization path to citizenship issue, there will be a significant need for pro bono bar. And so we're hoping that lawyers will take a look at that. Point two, I think that the tip of our activity on the detention issue is going to have to be focused on the private facilities and that 34,000 bed requirement. I mean, it's really unconscionable for Congress to set a goal of 34,000 individuals detained, completely divorced from whether there is a need for such a system and whether the existing system of detention can accommodate those who are needed for civil detention under protections that ensure a humane treatment and requirements consistent with our international obligations. So that's got to be changed. And we're going to have to go after the companies like the Corrections Corporation of America that have commoditized and profitized the issue of immigrant detention in ways that have distorted our policies. They work the interior of Congress. They are lobbyists par excellence. And they, in fact, determine the outcome of these processes. We're going to have to get in and shut that off. There is a moral dimension of this because the current system that treats people in our view, in a subhumane way, has to be changed. Now, lastly, I think on this issue of the system, I'm hopeful that a sufficient balance will be achieved so that the ability to regulate future flow is, in fact, more secure than it is today, that the needs of industry and workers together can be fashioned, and I think that can be done, and that we have a process that legalizes the population, and I hope it can be done before the 13-year time frame that has been set by the debate. My fear about that is not so much the length of time per se. It is the likelihood that a number of individuals who would otherwise be eligible for a path to citizenship will be weeded out because of artificially high barriers that criminalize activity that should not be viewed in major reform, at least for a generation or so. But then again, we thought that about 86, and we know what happened, right?
Richard, I'm going to give you the last chance to gaze into the crystal ball, and then I want to open it up for questions.
Tell me the crystal ball
so
again.
Basically, your hope, the hope of many people that we see a path to citizenship in this bill. How do we do this part of the system 4 or 5 years from now? Are we treating asylum applicants in a better way than we're treating them now? Is it a system that works in a more humane way? If you clear away, I mean, the numbers are so large. A lot of the discussion this morning was how hard it is because the numbers.
The numbers may change. I mean, we're undergoing a worldwide demographic revolution. We've had a worldwide population boom. We're now getting ready to have a worldwide population bust. It may be very well that 10 years from now we're paying people to come from Latin America to come into America to work because Mexico is going to be able to absorb most of its own labor force itself, and so will most of Latin America. I'm also fearful that and I pray I'm wrong, but I'm fearful that we may get a flood of persecution refugees, millions of mainly Christians who are forced to flee in peril of their lives. And it would be, in my opinion, contrary to our principles and our ideals as a nation to turn them away. That if the Statue of Liberty is there for a reason, and it expresses our noblest aspirations. I'm hoping that we can craft a comprehensive immigration reform proposal that will allow a more high-end immigration, will allow the low-end immigration as needed, and we'll have a guest worker program. One of the things that the task force report pointed out that I didn't know until I was on the task force is that of the people that are here in an undocumented status, only about 70% want to be citizens. The rest of them would rather come here, work, make money, and go home and open a garage with the money they've saved. And if they had regular access to their families, if they had an orderly way to cross the border without fear, without imperiling their lives, that it would facilitate those ties they have to the country of origin. And I think there are ways to get around the concern about competition. You could have a system where you could post a job for 60 days, and if no one takes the job, then you could go to a pre-approved applicant pool of guest workers who could come in and take the job. There are ways around this.
I agree.
I don't think there's any issue in the immigration reform debate that can't be solved and solved pretty cleanly if we just work together and quit playing politics with it. And this is going to take a disciplined coalition of the middle, because there are people on the left and on the right who have a vested interest in this issue not being solved for their own different reasons politically. And so it's going to take a disciplined coalition of the moderate right and the moderate left fending off their more radical colleagues to get this done.
Sure.
I would like to open it up for people with questions, and I may throw other things to our panelists as we go. I think we've still got about 25 minutes, so plenty of time. As we see, we've got a very wide ranging set of experience and expertise on our panel up here. So we'll start right here in the front.
We had a fairly
Sorry,
good...
as with everybody, can you identify yourself and
Right, my name is Mike Golash. I'm from the Amalgamated Transit Union.
Great.
We had a pretty good immigration policy for the first 150 years in this country. You came, you let you in at Ellis Allen. 5 years later, you became a citizen. Using that policy, we became a major industrial power. The question is, and since then, we've tried all sorts of different rules to regulate labor market flows, you know, the 1965 law, the 86 law, the 96 law, and all this led us to more and more problems. So I want to think, why don't we go back to the policies that we had initially? We just open up our borders and let people come. And when there's few jobs here, they'll leave. When there's more jobs, more will come. And let that sort of free migration of labor work itself out, basically. We'll save tremendous amounts of money tearing down these fences, closing down ICE or ICE, and closing down these detention centers, and we'll have, I think, a better world to live in and a better country.
Well, wow. Let me say, I hear your question. I think your view of the 150 years is somewhat romanticized. Well, I mean, okay, so except for the Chinese, the Exclusion Acts were a dog.
And the African Americans.
Well, I didn't want to go there.
the Southern
I mean, let me just say, the Chinese suffered and endured, obviously, hardships that I need not repeat here. The book entitled How the Irish Became White and talks about issues related to culture and race. Talk to the Southern Europeans in terms of how they experienced America. The restrictions that limited the Japanese from becoming citizens and led, in part, I mean, I don't want to overstate this, to the detention camp sort of speaks for itself. And in the 50s, when we had an overabundance of Latino labor that we had admitted in legally as guest workers in the 40s to do the jobs for which we had manpower, when they were forcibly deported under the rubric of Operation Wetback, in which over 1 million individuals were forcibly deported to Mexico, including U.S. citizens. You know, our immigration policy, truthfully, didn't work all that well. McCarran Walter speaks for itself. The racial quotas speak for themselves. I'm simply suggesting to you that that system, and which I understand, you know, how you might have the view that it worked well, for those who were the subcategories not highly favored at the time, experienced it differently. Today, the diversity that we celebrate is unique in some parts to the U.S. because we get people to adhere to a set of values that ensure that there is a commitment to the country, which often breaks down on the kind of tribalism and the difficulty of managing diversity that we see in places like Rwanda, the Middle East, Northern Ireland. I'm just saying we do it a little differently. I would hope that the immigration bill, which is being fashioned now, takes into account those core American values that we celebrate, sets up a path to citizenship, ensures that there are ways in which individuals can be assimilated into the American system, and does so in a way that is fair and reinstates some of the due process protections that we think are necessary to protect the system. Now, if we can do that, I think the reform will be meaningful and lasting, and so that's what I hope will happen.
Thank you. Other questions? We have one in the back far right here. If you have a question, just signal and I'll get you in the queue here. So.
Hi, thank you. My name is Anil Kalhan. I teach at the law school at Drexel University. And Mr. Henderson, I want to pick up on your comment about, on the occasion of Gideon versus Wainwright, the need for representation that comprehensive immigration reform will bring. I mean, as all of you know, we have a staggering representation crisis as it is, particularly for people in detention, but outside of whether people are going unrepresented or they don't have access to quality counsel. So what should be the, my question is really for all of you, as part and parcel of immigration reform, what are the range of things that should be done to ensure that people are represented, both in detention and outside? Because if you add millions of people who will need to be counseled on what isn't straightforward amnesty but an earned legalization program, I think that the existing framework for pro bono counsel probably isn't going to be sufficient.
Julie, could I actually start with you? Because you mentioned this, you know, in dealing with people in the detention system who don't have representation. How does it look different from the ICE side? Whether somebody's got a lawyer that you can deal with or somebody's effectively on their own trying to navigate incredibly complex. Let's start there and I'll give everyone a chance here. Yeah.
Sure. I mean, it makes it incredibly difficult for ICE, just as it does for a prosecutor. If somebody is representing themselves, it's always more difficult than if you have a lawyer involved. And you want to have a lawyer involved. It helps the individual. And then for ICE, you're not trying to make the decision. You're not trying to figure out, do they have a viable claim? And many ICE good lawyers try to see that if there's a viable claim, but they don't always know. And so having a lawyer involved, particularly for the vulnerable populations, I think is absolutely critical. The idea that an unaccompanied child can come here and go through immigration proceedings without a lawyer is just abominable. And same with people who have mental health issues or other things. So I think at a minimum, in my view, the legislation has to address the vulnerable populations. Beyond the minimum, I think we should look at potentially a broader right to counsel. And I think it makes good economic sense. The ABA and Arnold and Porter did a study last year that showed that cases where you have lawyers, they move more quickly. Sometimes people, if they know they don't have an option, they don't want to stay in detention and fight it for several years, right? They're going to go ahead and go home and make those decisions. So having lawyers has benefits and makes a ton of sense. And so I think it's critical, particularly for vulnerable populations. In my dream world, on my wish list, it'd be for everybody.
Rich, I was going to ask, in the asylum refugee context, is it the same kind of situation?
Yeah, I think so. Look, I'd pass tort reform in all 50 states, which would give a lot of lawyers a need for work, and they can work a lot cheaper for starters. That would make more lawyers available. I'm not joking. It works in Texas. We did tort reform there, and it works. I think that obviously the need to have representation, I think, is a basic right, and I think that we could, depending on the need, we could, fund scholarships for people who go to law school if they agree to do pro bono work for a certain number of years, sort of a domestic legal corps, like we have a teaching corps, and in the past have had some medical corps. It would let people who for whom law school is now economically not available. When I hear some people talk about, I have a lot of respect for President Reagan, but when he says, government's the problem, government's not always the problem. I'll just give you two examples of government programs that transformed the United States. One was the Homestead Act. You went out there and settled on land, they gave it to you. If you stayed on it for 5 years, the federal government gave you the land. That settled the lifetime. The World War II GI Bill. The World War II GI Bill transformed this nation. The government's investment in those veterans, basically, if you got into Princeton, Harvard, Yale, the government paid for it. They paid your tuition, your books, they paid you a living stipend to live on, and a whole generation of men who were the first in their generation to go to college. Our government's investment in those veterans is what is really the driving force behind the economic miracle of the last half of the 20th century in the United States. Now, those are both government programs. So, government can be the problem. It can also be part of the answer. And I think that some kind of domestic legal Peace Corps, where you give, if the government will pay your tuition to law school, if you agree to give 5 years of service in a public service context.
Professor, it's a great question. I'm the Rao Professor of Public Interest Law at the University of the District of Columbia. I sort of hesitate to answer for my colleagues who are in clinical programs providing legal assistance for immigrants because they are on the front lines, and I'd like to consult them. But let me try to tie Julie's comments and the Reverend's comments together. First of all, there is a need for counsel. There is a fundamental need for counsel, and that need is not being met. There is an ability to address it. I like, Richard, your idea of a legal core. It's called legal services. And if we could lift some of those restrictions that prevent them from representing immigrants and prevent them from using funds that they raise themselves, the so-called IOLTA funds, for the enforcement of immigration cases, we'd be better served. So I'm hoping that we can step back from the ideological warfare that has defined the last 2 generations of public service vis-a-vis the immigrant population and recognize that there are some cost-effective changes that could make a huge difference. So as Julie points out, look, if you had representation, it provides an economic relief. It's an economic benefit. You can demonstrate that. You, I think, help reduce the ideological resistance to having lawyers engaged. So I see clinical programs being helpful. I see legal services being helpful. I think Richard's proposal of additional funding to encourage those who engage in public service activity to have loan forgiveness. There is a glut right now, guys, in case you haven't read it, of lawyers who are coming out of school without jobs and are having a difficult time meeting the expectations that they have about what a law degree can provide.
And paying off their loans.
And paying off their loans, Richard. So there are solutions to this problem that I think could benefit the larger community if we could afford to.
I hope we got the record for this. This is a good idea. I think we've generated a very strong idea here. We got a question right up at the front. I mean, there has been so much research. Don Kerwin, who was on the CFR task force with it, I wish I could remember the exact numbers, but the rate of success in immigration cases, if you have counsel versus not having counsel, is somewhere like 15% versus 75%. I mean, it's night and day, the likelihood of you being able to win your case if you've got a lawyer. So we'll go right here.
Hi, my name is Karen Zwick, and I'm with the National Immigrant Justice Center. My question is, what else besides access to counsel? You've talked a lot about immigration court reform and how, on this panel and the one before, Julie, you mentioned the need for the courts to do a better job. So I'm wondering what else, obviously having lawyers in the courts would make them go much better, but what else can be done? And do you think that there's any movement from an administrative side to do some of those things administratively, even because they're probably not going to be addressed legislatively?
I think just having more judges would help, and so that people could move through the court system kind of more quickly. I think making sure that you have incentives so that you have courts in places where you have detention facilities. If you can't move the detention facility, let's make sure that there is actually a judge there and a permanent judge there, and provide some sort of incentives for those judges kind of to be there and to be paying attention to that. I think that looking more closely at, and ICE has done a lot of this, but looking more closely at what cases do not need to come into that system. What cases should we decline prosecution on immediately, right? So let's not kind of waste a lot of time on a case where 2 years down the road, ICE is going to say, well, actually, you're right. We do agree. I should make those decisions up front and not waste the judge's time. One thing that ICE is doing now is looking at expedited docket for some alternatives to detention cases, and I think that sort of thing is critical. Let's move some of those dockets more quickly so you're not waiting a year to have your case heard. But I know Juan Asuna will be here this afternoon, so I'm sure he has a lot of good ideas. I think there's a lot of work that can be done on the immigration court side.
I would just have 2 recommendations. One is restoring discretion to immigration judges. I think if you can do that, that's probably the single greatest contribution we could make. Secondly, I think the obstruction that we're seeing in the confirmation of judges, particularly at the district courts, courts of appeals, guys, it's a problem. When Judge Roll, the federal judge in Arizona, who had gone to see Gabby Gifford on the day that the 2 were shot, when he was there, he had gone to see her to complain about his immigration docket. Now, she could do nothing about it. She's in the House of Representatives, has no stroke in determining who is confirmed. But the fact that he sought her out to talk about the judicial emergency created in his district by a failure to confirm additional judges and the overwhelming nature of his immigration docket should tell us that unless we're able to create some safety valves for these communities that are inundated, particularly on the border and elsewhere with high dockets, we're going to have a continuing problem. So those are the 2 things that I would push.
Very good. We had a question. Far right corner, Laura.
Laura Murphy with the ACLU. I have a question for Richard. The federal government has, especially the FBI, argued in the aftermath of 9/11 that they should be able to investigate communities based on their religion. And I've heard repeatedly from the national security infrastructure that they want to use religion as a grounds to determine someone's eligibility. What do you think about giving ICE officials more leeway to discriminate based on religion?
I'm against it. As a Baptist, I'd be drummed out if I didn't resist it. I think you shouldn't. First of all, I think we have complete religious freedom in this country, and people have the right to practice their faith should have the right to practice their faith without fear of discrimination, and to advocate for their faith. If the federal government finds that activities are going on anywhere, I don't think being part of a religion would protect you from criminal activity. We had this debate. Let me put it in a less explosive context. We had a debate in this country when I was in seminary back in the early 70s over a cult, and several cults, including one cult called the Children of God, who would kidnap people and hold them until they could sort of brainwash them into becoming part of the children of God. And there was actually discussion about, let's make the children of God illegal. And we made the very wise choice as a nation, no, we shouldn't make any group illegal. We should prosecute people when they break the law. Kidnapping is against the law, whether you do it to sell them Tupperware or whether you do it to make them, to try to make them part of your religion. It's illegal. So you prosecute and you monitor illegal activity, not religious belief or religious proclamation or religious advocacy. So, for instance, if you want to advocate to have, if someone wanted to advocate to have Islam as the state religion of America, that's their right. They have a First Amendment freedom to do that. They have a First Amendment freedom to work for that. What they don't have the right to do is try to enforce that beyond the rule of law. In other words, by acts of terror or any other way. So you would monitor acts of terror or planning for terror acts, not religious beliefs. Whether it's done by people who are anarchists, or people who are doing it in the name of some religious faith. But no, it would be, in my opinion, unconstitutional, as well as un-American, to profile people based upon their religious belief.
I want to push on this a little bit, though, because this is a difficult question. Okay, so we're talking in this context about risk assessment. So we've apprehended someone who's out of status, and we're making a decision, say, do we detain this person, or do we allow them to be released under some alternatives program? As government is going to create a profile of that person. Now, the question is, how can you create a profile that helps in risk assessment without profiling in the way we're talking about here? And this has been a challenge in everything post 9/11. It's been a challenge in the visa system. It's been a challenge in all aspects of border security, because everybody talks about, well, we need to separate the people who are not threatening from the people who are threatening. And you can't do that without profiles of some sort. Well, but the issue of racial profiling, religious profiling is a big problem. So, Julie, maybe could you say something on that first, and then we'll go back?
He was anxious to.
Because I think this is a really important debate that we're having in the whole post 9/11 world about how.
Look, mine is very simple. I think there is a fine line in answering your question, Ted. So there does need to be a sort of balanced assessment. But I also think there's a bright line where you should not cross. So when the Census Bureau decides to make census data, zip code data, available to an enforcement agency for purposes of identifying the likely Muslim populations in a community, that's a bridge too far. You've crossed the line. When you, as Peter King, chair of the House Committee on Homeland Security, decide to hold a set of 5 hearings in which you demonize Muslims around this question of whether they in fact pose a real threat to society, that's a bridge too far. That's a bright line. I guess what I'm suggesting is that profiling, which is based on empirical evidence of the commission of past crimes, is one thing. And I'm not trying to constrain the law enforcement agencies from doing an effective job. None of us wants to be blown up on an airplane or subjected to, a failure of the enforcement agencies to do their job. which allow them to cross that bright line in the name of national security, where there is literally no evidence to support that. We didn't talk about Guantanamo here. It's probably not appropriate. I'm sure you've discussed it already. But having said that, come on. These are examples of issues that have to be addressed more carefully, I think.
No, I think it's incredibly difficult. That's why I wanted to hear your thoughts, so I could think of something brilliant to say. But alas, that is not. That's not. No one raises their hand and say, "Hey, I'm the threat." These other guys are not the threat. And so when someone comes into custody, whether it's in ICE custody or other law enforcement custody or state and local custody, you're having to make that determination. What we want in the risk assessment is to use the best empirical, scientific evidence that we have, and then we want folks, frankly, like CRCL, OIG's office, other places to weigh in, so that ICE officials and others kind of don't make those mistakes. And I think that's the kind of thing that keeps you up at night, right? Is trying to decide where to do that in an appropriate way, not to violate. At the time I was there, it was the DOJ's guidance against profiling, but any updated guidance, like how do you not do that, and how do you make sure it's right? And one thing that I think is a little bit helpful in this area is that you have a convergence of agencies, and actually in many respects, ICE being out of DOJ causes problems, right? Because you're fighting with the OAR, or there's other sorts of things. But here, it could be a little bit helpful because you have the FBI or other agencies, and you're all kind of looking together. So hopefully you have a lot of smart minds if you're getting to a place that crosses the line where people say, wait a minute, let's step back, let's take a look. But it's very, very tough. So I'm hoping the next Council on Foreign Relations report will solve that.
We actually tried to do a task force on this subject, couldn't reach consensus. The only time in Council's history where we've not.
Really?
It's a tough issue. We've got about 3 minutes left, so this is going to be the last question here and brief responses. The microphone's coming.
Hi, my name is Saba Ahmed. I am a Muslim American, and I was 16 when 9/11 happened. Had nothing to do with it, but I live with it every day because I am targeted. I am called names. Not that I raise my hand saying I'm a terrorist threat, but just because I wear my life, just do regular stuff. And I am just so sick of it that I really feel for the immigration community. I come from Portland, Oregon, and I've represented people in Tacoma. And I've watched how people can't even hold their kids. We have destroyed families. We have ruined and there's just no way to explain the devastation that we've caused to 400,000 families a year. That's what we destroy. And I really urge that you look at the human aspect to what we're doing, because, these numbers can never be justified. We spend $100 billion plus per year on national security. Whenever religious profiling comes in, there's always a national security exception for Muslims. You can target them. And it's just sad to see whatever has been going on, and I really hope that you would look into the human aspects of how these policies destroy lives. Thank you.
Thank you for sharing your personal story. That's very hard to do. And I think what you've described is an experience that is shared by far too many, both Americans and immigrants alike, who in this period of hyper-suspicion are targeted in unjust ways. Now, I will say that a lot of credit goes to our Justice Department and the Civil Rights Division for trying to fight overt examples of intolerance and hatred. The effort being made by a task force of U.S. attorneys to address hate crime prosecutions, the mosque attacks in Murfreesboro, Tennessee, the hostility toward Park 51 in New York, raise real questions. When politicians have spoken out, I'm very proud that the Leadership Conference was prepared to confront and did Peter King when he held his first set of hearings, which in our view went too far in characterizing Muslims as a national security threat, and given his posture as chair of the committee, raised real questions about the reach of government in that effort. You may recall that Congressman Keith Ellison showed great emotion when he testified before Peter King at that hearing. No one should have to endure that. I think that this, only through a comprehensive bill, can we address this issue of splitting up families. If you meet with Janet Napolitano, she will tell you, look, I'm not hostile to keeping families together. I'm carrying out my enforcement priorities as best I can. And if you are trying to resolve the issue of the breakup of families, the way to do that is to pass a comprehensive immigration bill that takes the foot off my pedal, that makes me enforce the laws in the way that I do. I think that's a reasonable position. And that's why this movement on getting a bill is so important. It addresses the issues that you've identified.
I think that's a tremendous note on which to end this discussion, which is with a real emphasis on millions of lives that are at stake here and how this gets handled.
Can I make one observation? That I think, we tend to take this for granted because it's part of the furniture in the room. But we're a unique country. We're the only country in the world that is described and identified not by ethnicities, but by ideology. Anybody can become an American. In a way, you cannot become French. Now, if I lost my mind, I could probably go through all the legal hurdles and become a citizen of France. But I would not be a Frenchman. That implies a civilization issue that I don't possess or desire. But anybody can become an American. You can come from Korea, you can come from China, you can come from Nigeria, you can come from Egypt, and you can become an American in a sense that you cannot become British or English or German. We are defined by our common assent to a sort of a secular creed that is laid out in the Declaration of Independence and codified in the Constitution. And that's why we're having this debate. Because I've talked to someone who's got a PhD from a German university, who's come to America, who works in the federal government, and I asked him why. I said, I've been to Germany. Germany's a nice country. He said, you have so much more freedom here than we have in Germany that it would take me a couple of hours to describe the ways that we are more free here to be who we want to be. So, let's all just, whichever God we pray to, let's give thanks that in His providence we are Americans.
And let's give thanks to our panelists for a tremendous discussion. Thank you.
Good for that, Jeff.
Good job.